When Irene Thibodeau died in the back room of her own tailor shop at 73 years old, her 3 children settled what she'd left behind in 11 days. The house on Champlain Street sold before the funeral flowers had wilted. The savings account, just over $22,000 after the lawyer's fees and the cost of the headstone, was divided the morning after the reading of the will. Her son Warren took the car, a 9-year-old Civic he'd been borrowing for 2 years anyway. He took the good furniture and the tools from the basement and sold half of them to a man who answered a Kijiji ad, before his younger sister even knew they were gone. What he did not want was the tailor shop. It sat on Rue des Pins in the old part of Saint-Édouard, a 2-story building with a warped front door, a hand-painted sign that had been faded for so long nobody remembered when it was new, and a back room full of what Warren called clutter. He dropped the keys on the kitchen counter beside 2 cardboard boxes he'd already packed. "It's been losing money for 3 years," he said. "There's a company that does estate cleanouts. They'll take the machines, the fabric, whatever. You'd clear maybe $500 if you're lucky." He nudged the boxes toward his sister with his foot. "Mom's stuff from the shop. Thread, some old notebooks, a tin full of buttons. I went through it. There's nothing worth anything." His sister Agnes picked up the keys. They were on a brass ring worn smooth, and the largest had a strip of masking tape on it, yellowed and half-curled, with front, written in their mother's careful hand. "That's it then," Agnes said. "That's it." She looked around the kitchen, already half-emptied, already becoming someone else's house. "I guess that's it," she said. Agnes Thibodeau was 54 years old, recently divorced, and living in a 1-bedroom apartment above a Vietnamese restaurant in Gatineau. The radiator worked when it felt like it. The lease was month to month. On her kitchen table sat a stack of envelopes she'd stopped opening, credit card statements, and one from her former accountant that she already knew the contents of. 12 years of bookkeeping work, first for her ex-husband's landscaping company, and then, when the marriage ended, for a string of small clients she could never hold on to. The divorce had cost her the house, most of the furniture, and a confidence she hadn't yet found a way to rebuild. She had driven down to Saint-Édouard for the funeral and stayed, because there was nothing in Gatineau pulling her back. She had not been inside her mother's shop in 6 years. She had not sewn a stitch in longer than that, though she'd grown up in that back room, sitting on a step stool watching Irene's hands move over fabric with a precision that looked effortless and wasn't. She had traded all of that for a life that had since unraveled at every seam. Now it was a Thursday in late November, and the tailor shop sat waiting for her at the end of a street she'd spent her adult life avoiding. She parked in front of it and sat behind the wheel for a while before she could make herself go in. The estate cleanout company opened at 9. If she could empty the place by then, she could hand them the keys and drive back north, and figure out what a woman does when she has very nearly run out of road. She unlocked the front door. The smell reached her before her eyes adjusted, wool and cedar, and something beneath it that was simply her mother, the way a person's presence lingers in a place long after the person is gone. Pressing boards and chalk and the faint chemical sweetness of dry cleaning fluid from the shop, 2 doors down, that had been drifting through the walls for 50 years. Agnes stood in the doorway and breathed it. The shop was exactly as Irene had left it. A counter at the front with a brass bell. 6 wooden chairs along the wall where customers waited, their cushions worn smooth. 2 dress forms standing near the window, each with a name tag pinned to the shoulder. Mrs. Lavallee on one, Bertrand Wedding on the other, as if someone might still come to collect. The work table in the center of the room, its surface gouged by decades of shears and marked with fading chalk lines, and above the counter, on a corkboard bristling with pins, the last note her mother had written in the appointment book, the handwriting looser than Agnes remembered. Thursday, hem for Paulette. New buttons for Mr. Cyr, and whatever else walks in. Agnes stared at those last 4 words a long time before she understood she didn't understand them. Whatever else walks in was not an appointment. It was something else, and she had no idea what. She walked the length of the shop, running her hand along the counter the way she used to, when she was small enough to walk under it. The machines behind the partition were covered with cotton drop cloths, each one draped with a care that said someone had planned to come back. The workroom beyond the partition was clean, far cleaner than an old woman who'd been dying slowly for 8 months had any right to have kept it. The surfaces were clear, the thread organized by color on the wall rack, the way it had always been, the same order Agnes had memorized as a girl. Warm tones on the left, cool tones on the right. Whites and blacks in the middle where you could grab them without looking. Someone had been keeping this room, and her mother had been dead for 10 days. That was the first thing that didn't fit. There would be more before the morning was over. In the far corner of the workroom, half hidden behind the industrial serger, was a door Agnes had always believed was a closet. She had never seen it open. It had a latch like a closet, a plain brass plate tarnished nearly black, and she had asked about it once when she was maybe 8 years old, and Irene had said, "Storage," in the tone that meant the conversation was finished. The door was not locked. Inside was not a closet. It was a narrow room, barely wider than Agnes's shoulders, with a single light bulb on a pull chain and shelves running floor to ceiling on both sides. The shelves on the left held bolts of fabric, older ones, wool and cotton, and a beautiful dove-gray flannel she recognized from a coat her mother had made her at 16. The shelves on the right held something else entirely. Shoeboxes, dozens of them. Each one labeled in her mother's hand on a strip of masking tape, not with shoe brands, with years. 1994, 1995, 2001, 2002, 2003, all the way to a box near the bottom, labeled simply in newer ink, last ones, 1994, 1995, 2001, 2003, all the way to a box near the bottom, labeled simply in newer ink, last ones. And on the floor, tucked into the corner as if it had been placed there with intention, a flat metal box with a hasp and a small combination lock. Agnes's heart had started doing something it hadn't done in a long time. The combination lock opened on the third try, her mother's birthday, backwards. Inside the metal box were 4 things: a passbook from the Caisse Populaire de Saint-Edouard, the cover worn to a gray softness, a sealed envelope from a law firm in town, Archambault and Girard, notaires, with a note clipped to the front in her mother's hand, for Agnes, not Warren. A deed, folded in thirds, the paper thickened with age. And underneath it all, a plain white envelope with a single word on the front written in blue ballpoint, in the hand Agnes had known her whole life and had stopped reading the love in years ago. Agnes. She sat down on the floor of that narrow room with the boxes around her and the light bulb swaying slightly above her head. And her hands were not entirely steady. If you followed Agnes this far into that back room, stay with me. Because what was inside those shoeboxes is about to change the shape of everything she thought she knew about her mother, and none of it is what any of them expected. She opened the passbook first. The account was in Irene Thibodeau's name. The first deposit was dated 34 years ago, $12. After that, the entries ran down the pages in a column so long it took 3 passbooks, tucked inside the first, to hold them all. Deposits nearly every week, never large. Sometimes $3, sometimes $8. Once 20. The deposits were not regular the way a savings plan is regular. They were irregular the way money is when it comes from somewhere unpredictable. The final entry, dated 6 weeks before Irene died, showed a balance of $41,200. Agnes read the number 3 times. Her mother had sewn alterations for 40 years. She charged $20 to hem a pair of trousers and $12.50 to replace a zipper. And she had never once raised her prices enough, which was a constant source of low-level argument in the family. Warren called it a hobby. Their father, before he left, had called it worse. And here in a passbook that no one had known existed, a number that said something entirely different about a woman everyone had underestimated for half a century. She opened the shoebox labeled 1987. Inside were folded pieces of paper, notes, some on notepaper, some on the back of receipts, some on torn corners of envelopes. Her mother's handwriting, small and even, dated at the top of each one. March 14, 1987. Took in a winter coat for a woman who came in off the street asking if I did repairs. Coat was past repairing, lining gone, collar frayed through. I told her it would cost more to fix than to replace, and she looked at me with a face I recognized. I told her I'd found a coat in the back, forgotten by a customer, that happened to fit her. I hadn't. I made her one over the weekend from the gray flannel. Left it on her chair Monday with a note saying the repair had come to nothing and there was no charge. Agnes set that note down. She picked up another. November 2, 1987. A man came in for a suit alteration. Dropped his wallet, pulling out his card. I saw what was in it. I didn't say anything. I charged him for the alteration, and then I made the same meal mistake I always make. I accidentally sewed an extra $50 into the inner pocket with a loose stitch. The way my mother used to do with letters she wanted found later. He'll find it when the lining wears. Maybe not for years. That's all right. Agnes sat back against the shelf. She looked at the rows of shoeboxes. She did not move for a long time. She opened the box labeled Last Ones. On top was a note in her mother's handwriting, but looser now, the letters larger, the way a person writes when their hands have started to argue with them. If you're reading this, you've found the small room. That means you were willing to clean the place out yourself, which means you're the one. You always were the one, Agnes. You just had to lose enough to come back and see it. I know you think I'm a stubborn old woman who priced herself out of a living and left you nothing, but the shop is not nothing. And I need you to read the rest before you decide what to do with it. Agnes looked at the white envelope with her name on it. She set it aside for now. She needed to understand the room before she could read the letter. She took down the 1994-1995 box and opened it. The notes inside were longer, more urgent. Several were about a single family. A mother and 2 children, no father mentioned. Entries spread over 18 months, each one dated. Each one a specific act recorded with the same plain precision her mother had applied to measurements and seam allowances. January 6, 1994. Celine came in again with the children. I said I had too much work for one person and asked if she'd like to earn a few dollars pressing seams. She said yes. She is too proud to take money she hasn't worked for, so I give her work and I overpay for it, and I keep the arithmetic simple so she can't argue. Her daughter watched everything with eyes like a hawk. Maybe 11 years old, reminded me of someone. Agnes read the name of that daughter, then she read it again. She got up so fast she hit her shoulder on the shelf and barely felt it. She walked out of the narrow room and through the workroom and out to the shop front, and she stood at the window, looking at Rue des Pins and breathing. The girl's name in that notebook entry was a name she knew, had known for 20 years. A woman named Stephanie who worked now at the pharmacy on the corner, who had brought a casserole to the house the day of Irene's funeral, who had stood in the kitchen holding Agnes's hand and saying, "Ling, your mother was the kindest woman I ever met. I've owed her everything since I was 11 years old and I never told her enough." Agnes had thought she meant small kindnesses, neighborly ones. She went back into the narrow room. She opened the box labeled 2001. She opened the one labeled 2002-2003. She read for an hour on the floor of that narrow room while the morning moved around her outside the frosted window. She forgot entirely about the estate cleanout company. She forgot about the drive back to Gatineau. She read about a town she had grown up in and never seen. The town her mother had been quietly holding together from the back room of a tailor shop on a street. Most people drove through without stopping. A teenage boy in the mid-90s, sleeping rough behind the building for 4 nights before Irene noticed, and began leaving the side door unlocked, and a blanket on the cutting table, saying nothing, letting him come and go until his situation resolved itself the way it eventually did, which was that it didn't resolve itself at all until Irene walked him to the rectory herself and stood there until Father Lemieux found him a bed. A woman who came in twice a year for minor alterations for 15 years, always alone, always with long sleeves, even in July. Irene never said a word about it. She made her tea and talked about the weather and charged her $3 less each time until the visit stopped. And then Irene wrote simply, "She left him. She's in Rimouski now." The last alteration was a dress for a date she mentioned while pretending she wasn't mentioning it. I charged her nothing. A man who had lost his machinist job at 58 and came in to have a suit taken in because he'd lost 30 pounds. And Irene noted, without comment, that it was the kind of weight a person loses when they're not eating enough. She altered the suit and charged him for the fabric only. She began sending her neighbor by with food, attributing it always to excess. "I made too much soup again, would your husband take some?" So he'd never have to know it came from her. She was not keeping these notes to remember the kindness. She was keeping them so that someone, someday, would know the people had been real. Agnes picked up the white envelope. She unfolded 3 pages, the writing steady at the top and softer by the end. "Dear Agnes, I've never been good at saying things out loud. Your father used to say I expressed myself through fabric, and that was both a compliment and a complaint, and he wasn't wrong about either. So I wrote it down instead, and I put it where only someone willing to do the hard, unglamorous work of emptying this shop would ever find it. I figured if you were on your knees in that storage room, you were ready. You probably noticed the shop is too clean for a woman who was too sick to stand for the last 8 months. That's Paulette Mercier from across the street. She has a key. She's had a key for 11 years and she's never once used it for anything, except to check the pipes in January and water the plant I kept forgetting. The deed in the box is for this building. I bought it 19 years ago for $48,000, cash I'd saved since before you were born. I paid it off in 12 years. I put it in a trust after that, so no one could sell it out from under what it's for. Warren won't know about it. I'm sorry to say that about your brother, but he measures everything in what it costs to keep, and I couldn't afford to let him make that calculation about this place. The money in the case is for one thing: keeping the shop open and keeping the next person warm. I know you've been struggling. Warren told me a little, and I heard the rest in how you talked around it on the phone. I know the divorce cost you more than money. I know you've been ashamed, and I know you think shame is a private thing, but I recognized it in your voice, the way I recognized it in the woman with the long sleeves, the way I've recognized it in 50 years of people who came through that door, asking for something small and meaning something much larger. I'm asking you to keep going, not for me. For the next one, there's a notarial note in the envelope from Archibald and Gerard. Go see them, and leave the side door unlocked when you can. That's all I ever figured out that was worth knowing. I love you more than I ever said, and I was wrong not to say it. I'm saying it now. Agnes sat on the floor of the narrow room with her mother's letter pressed flat against her chest, and outside the frosted window the morning had gone from pale to gold, and she was crying in a way she hadn't let herself cry in years, the kind that comes up from somewhere sealed for her mother, and for the 6 years of distance and the visits she'd cut short, and the Sunday calls she'd let go to voicemail, and the one Christmas she hadn't come back for, because she couldn't stand the thought of walking through that door, and her mother seeing what had become of her. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. Warren, hey. His voice had the careful official tone he used when he was managing something. I got a call this morning from a property company. They're doing a commercial corridor assessment on Rue des Pins. There's a rezoning application going through. They want to put in mixed residential and retail. They want to know if we have any holdings on that block. A pause. Did you know Mom owned the building? Agnes said nothing, because apparently she did, and if she owned the building, that needs to go through the estate. The property company says the block is worth significant development money if the rezoning goes through. We're talking potentially 140, 150 for a corner lot that size. It's not part of the estate, Agnes said. Of course it is. It's in a trust. It's been in a trust for 11 years. A silence. What kind of trust? The kind Dad's lawyers can look at if you want. Archibald and Gerard in town. She kept her voice even. It was a voice she hadn't used in years. The voice she'd used when she was still good at her work, when someone's numbers were wrong and she had to tell them clearly and without apology. Mom put it in trust for a specific purpose. You have no claim on it. Agnes, listen to me. A woman who's been sewing curtains for 40 years does not set up legal trusts. She was sick for over a year before she died. Whatever she signed at the end. She signed it 11 years ago, Warren, when she was 62 years old and fully herself. She looked down at the letter in her hand, and I'm not arguing this on the phone. She hung up and her hand was steady. Paulette Mercier from across the street arrived 40 minutes later with a coffee in each hand, the way Agnes suspected she'd been doing for years. She was past 70, small and quick-moving, with the kind of posture that comes from a lifetime of physical competence. She stopped in the doorway of the narrow room and looked at the open metal box, and the shoeboxes stacked on the floor, and her face went still in the particular way of someone who has been holding a long secret and has just been relieved of it. You found it, Paulette said. It wasn't a question. You knew? Not everything. Nobody knew everything but Irene. She came in and sat down on the step stool Agnes had been using, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup. I knew about the room. I've watered that plant across the shop for 11 years and I know every corner of this place by now. But she never showed me the boxes, she said. Paulette paused, pressing her lips together. She said if anything ever happened to her, the right person would come and find them. She said she'd know which one it was. She meant me, Agnes said. She meant you. Paulette looked at her for a moment. Your mother talked about you more than you'd ever believe. She kept a photograph of you above the pressing board. Not Warren, you. Agnes couldn't speak for a moment. I didn't come back enough, she said finally. No, Paulette said. You didn't. But you came back now, and you're on your knees in that storage room, and that's the part she always said would matter. If you're still here with Agnes in that back room, do us a favor and hit subscribe. Because the people who came through that door over the next 3s are the part of this story we've been waiting the whole time to tell you. Word moves fast in a town like St. Edouard. By the next morning, Agnes had not called the estate clean-out company. She had not driven back to Gatineau. She was sitting at her mother's work table with the shoeboxes open around her, and the passbook and the letter, and a legal pad on which she'd been writing names. When the front doorbell rang and she looked up to find Stephanie from the pharmacy standing in the doorway with her coat still buttoned and her eyes already filling. "I heard you were here," Stephanie said. "I had to come." She crossed the shop and sat down across from Agnes without being asked, the way people sit down in a place where they've always been welcome. "I was 11 years old," she said. "My mother had nothing. My father had been gone since the spring, and we were behind on the heating, and there was almost nothing in the house to eat, and my mother was too proud to go to the church for the food hampers because she didn't want anyone to know." Stephanie looked at her hands. "Your mother started giving my mother work. Just small things. Pressing, basic repairs. She overpaid and my mother knew it, but your mother always had a reason, too busy, getting older. These things are harder than they look, Céline. I need the help." She shook her head. "We ate that winter because of Irene Thibodeau, and my mother ate because she believed she'd earned it. Your mother made sure of that." Agnes thought of the entry in the 1994 box. "She is too proud to take money she hasn't worked for, so I give her work." "She never told anyone," Agnes said. "Never. My mother figured some of it out eventually, but by then enough time had passed that she couldn't argue with it anymore." Stephanie smiled, though her eyes were wet. "I send my kids in here for their school uniforms every September. Your mother never let me pay the full price. She always had a reason for that too." After Stephanie came others. An older man named Donat, who said quietly that he had slept in the back room of this shop for 4 nights when he was 16 and lost, and that the woman who ran it had said nothing about it until the last morning, when she'd put a bus ticket and $20 on the cutting table and told him to go to his aunt in Trois-Rivières and to telephone first so the woman wouldn't be frightened. He had a daughter now, he said. She was studying nursing in Montreal. After him, a woman in her 40s named Lucy, who had come every winter for years, not for alterations, but to sit in the waiting chairs with her coffee and not be home. Irene had asked no questions. She had charged nothing. She had simply opened the door when she saw Lucy coming and poured the coffee before she was asked. "She gave me somewhere to breathe," Lucy said. "Some winters that was the only place I had." A retired teacher named Bernard who had come in for the same worn jacket every fall for 30 years, always with some small repair that didn't need doing, and who had eventually admitted to Agnes over a cup of tea that the jacket had become a pretext and that he came because talking to Irene was the closest thing he had to having someone who remembered his wife alongside him. She asked about Marguerite every time, he said. Never forgot a detail. What Marguerite had liked, what she'd worn, what she'd ordered the one time they'd run into each other at the St. Jean-Baptiste dinner in 1998. Your mother had the memory of a saint and the discretion of a priest. Agnes read from her mother's notes that evening after they'd gone. She found Bernard there. The old teacher came again. He gets 1 cup of tea per visit and he drinks it slowly, and I let him talk about Marguerite for as long as he needs to. I never charge him for the coffee. I do charge him $1.50 for the button I supposedly replace on his jacket each time, because he needs to feel he's paying for something. Dignity is not complicated. It's mostly just about not making people feel small for needing you. She read that passage 3 times. Then she went back to her mother's letter and found the line she kept returning to. "I know you've been ashamed. I recognized it in your voice. You think you failed at things that meant everything, and that the failure says something permanent about who you are. It doesn't. A hem comes undone. You restitch it. That's not failure. That's just sewing." The letter from Warren's lawyer arrived on Friday. It challenged the trust on the grounds that Irene had exhibited signs of cognitive decline in the years before her death, citing the hidden account, the concealed property, the systematic secrecy about her financial activities as evidence of compromised judgment. It asked for a review before any decisions were made about the building or the funds. Agnes set the letter down on the work table, and Paulette, who was trimming a bolt of fabric in the corner, saw her face through the partition window and came through. Agnes handed her the letter without a word. Paulette read it. She set it on the table and went to the supply cabinet in the corner and came back with a cardboard box. Inside were 11 years of invoices from the shop, every repair, every alteration, every customer. written in Irene's clear hand on the standardized form she'd used since before Agnes was born. Paulette set the box on the table. "Every one of those is in her handwriting," Paulette said, sharp as the day she learned to write. "You want to bring those to a judge and have someone try to call Irene Thibodeau confused." She folded her hands. "Half this town has been sitting in these chairs for 40 years. They'll come." They came. The hearing was held in the small conference room at the municipal courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon. Not a formal trial. A review requested by Warren's lawyer to determine whether the trust could be contested. Agnes sat on one side with the notary from Archambault and Girard, a composed woman named Carrier, who had met with Irene annually for 11 years, and who had brought the file and her own notes to the table. Warren sat on the other side with his lawyer and his wife Sylvie behind him with her coat on and her phone face down on her lap. The chairs at the back were full. Stephanie was there, Donut, Lucy, Bernard. A woman Agnes didn't know who introduced herself to the clerk as Claudette and said she'd driven 3 hours from Quebec City to be in this room. A young man in his 20s who turned out to be Donat's son, who had come because his father had told him what this place had done for their family and he'd felt he should be in the room when somebody tried to call the woman who'd done it incompetent. Paulette was there in her good coat, sitting straight as a measuring rod. Warren's lawyer made his argument: hidden assets, systematic concealment of financial information from family members, a pattern of secretive conduct inconsistent with sound judgment. He used the word irrational twice. Carrier responded with the medical file first. 11 years of clear-headed, detailed annual reviews of the trust documents, every one of them signed in Irene's own hand, the language precise and forward-thinking. Then the invoices. Then the testimony. The judge allowed it. Stephanie stood first. She said that Irene Thibodeau had kept her family alive and fed through the worst winter of their lives, and had done it in a way that left her mother's dignity intact, and that a woman capable of that kind of detailed, sustained, carefully managed care for a family that wasn't hers was not a woman whose mind was compromised. Donat stood and said that the woman who had put a bus ticket on a cutting table for a frightened 16-year-old and known exactly how to do it, without making him feel like charity, was one of the sharpest people he had ever encountered. Lucy stood and said only that for 4 winters Irene had given her somewhere to be when she had nowhere safe to go, and had never once asked why, and that kind of precise reading of what a person needed without being told was not the work of someone losing her grip on things. Bernard stood last. He said that for 30 years Irene had asked him about his wife by name, every visit, same questions, the same details, the same genuine interest, and that a woman who retained that kind of specific, loving attention to another person's grief for 30 consecutive years, without any prompting, was not a woman with a fading mind. She was a woman with more mind than most people ever use. Warren sat through all of it. He didn't look at his lawyer or at Sylvie. He watched the faces, one after another, describing a woman he had eaten Sunday dinners with for 50 years and somehow never known. The judge reviewed the documents and dismissed the challenge before the afternoon was over. The trust was valid. Agnes was the sole trustee. The matter was closed. Warren's lawyer gathered his papers. Sylvie was up and moving before the chairs had stopped scraping. Warren sat for a moment longer, then stood, and to reach the door he had to walk the length of the row of people who had come for his mother. He didn't stop. But when he reached the end of the row and came even with Agnes, he slowed, and he looked at her, and whatever he'd been carrying behind his eyes cracked slightly, the way old fabric cracks along a hidden seam, and she saw underneath it something she hadn't seen on his face before, something that was going to take time to work itself out, and would and was not her responsibility to rush. Then he went through the door. Winter came properly. The shop looked different by December. The front window cleaned for the first time in years, the display space rearranged, so the morning light came in properly. Paulette had found, in a box on the upper shelf, 12 yards of the dove-gray flannel Agnes, remembered from the coat she'd been given at 16, and they had argued pleasantly for 3 evenings about what to do with it, and concluded there was no hurry. Agnes had called Archambault and Girard the week after the hearing and gone through everything. The trust was exactly as her mother had set it up. The building and the funds held in perpetuity for the provision of alterations and repairs to anyone who couldn't pay, and for whatever else the shop could be for the people who came through the door with something they couldn't say out loud. Irene had used that phrase herself in the trust document, the notary told her. Whatever else walks in. the same words that were on the appointment book. She had also left a note in the file with Carrier, to be read to Agnes if it ever came to a legal challenge. It says, Carrier told her, looking down at the file, Agnes will think she's not ready. She's been ready since she was 8 years old, standing on a step stool watching me work. Tell her the seam was always there. She just needs to press it open. Agnes closed her eyes briefly. She reopened the shop the second week of December. No announcement. She turned on the lights and unlocked the front door and went to work, the same way her mother had gone to work for 40 years. The appointments board had 3 names on it, carried forward from Irene's last week, customers who hadn't yet heard, and Agnes called each of them and said she was Irene Thibodeau's daughter, and she was open if they still needed the work done. All 3 came in. 2 of them cried when they walked through the door and saw the dress forms still in the window. Paulette came every day for the first week, ostensibly to help with the reorganization, and in practice, to make sure Agnes remembered to eat and to tell her, at intervals, things about her mother she hadn't known. How Irene had learned to sew from her own mother in a kitchen in rural Quebec with no pattern and no proper scissors. How she had come to Saint-Édouard at 23 with $40, and the conviction that a tailor shop was something the town needed, and the town had not been particularly convinced at first. How the first 5 years had been very hard and the next 35 had been their own kind of hard in different ways. And through all of it, the thing that kept her going was the side door and the shoeboxes, and the quiet, ongoing project of noticing who needed something and finding a way to give it to them without making them feel small. She used to say. Paulette told her one evening over the tea Agnes had started making at 4:30 the way her mother always had, that the shop was just a pretext, that what she was really running was a door, a place you could knock on when you had nowhere else to knock. She wrapped both hands around her cup. She kept it open for 50 years. She just needed to find the right person to leave the key to. The shoebox labeled, last ones had a second item in it that Agnes hadn't noticed the first time through. A small index card tucked under the legal envelope. On it, in her mother's handwriting, was a list of names, 8 of them, with addresses and phone numbers, most of them local, one in Montreal, one with an area code she had to look up. At the bottom of the card in a different ink, as if added later, these are the ones who gave to the jar. They'll know what it means. Call them. Agnes had found the jar the second day, a large mason jar on the shelf beneath the counter, filled with bills and coins and a label in her mother's hand that read, for whoever needs it next. She had understood immediately. She had set it back on the shelf. She called the names on the index card the following Monday, one by one. She said she was Irene's daughter, and that she was keeping the shop open and that she thought they might like to know. Every one of them already knew. 3 of them came in that week and added to the jar. One sent a money order in the mail with a note that said only, for the next one, your mother was a good woman. Don't let the door close. She didn't. Warren came in on a Friday morning in late January. No tie. He stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the work table and the corkboard with its layers of photographs. Irene, at every decade, always in the background, always doing something with her hands. And at the dress forms and the appointment board, and at the display in the window where Agnes had finished repairing Mrs. Lavallee's garment and begun something new in the dove-gray flannel. Agnes came out from behind the partition. "Can we talk?" Warren said. She led him to the 2 chairs at the front of the shop, the ones near the window where the light came in, and they sat there the way customers sat, which was unusual, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "I went through the boxes," Warren said. He was looking at the window, not at her. "The ones I'd taken from the shop, I hadn't opened them. I opened them last week." He was quiet for a moment. There was a notebook in there. Not one of the shoeboxes, a separate one. She must have kept it in the main room. Agnes waited. "There's an entry in it from 3 years ago," he said. "About me." He stopped again, and the pause had something in it that took effort to hold. "She wrote that I'd come for dinner and I'd spent most of it on my phone dealing with a deal that fell through. And she'd watched me do it, and she hadn't said anything, and when I left she wrote." Warren is always solving the problem in front of him. He never learned to look at the one behind it. That's my fault, not his. I taught the children that work was the way to prove your worth, and Agnes understood eventually that some work doesn't look like work, and Warren hasn't yet, but I think he will. I hope he will. Agnes said nothing. She had learned from the shoeboxes that some things needed no response. "I went through the whole notebook," Warren said. He reached into his jacket and took out an envelope. The house sale cleared about $64,000 after costs. I kept half. That's the other half. He held it out. It's made out to the trust. Agnes took it. It's not enough, Warren said. I know that. But I didn't know what she was. I lived down the road my whole life and I never went and looked. No, Agnes said. You didn't? He nodded, which she understood as agreeing rather than defending. She wrote something else in that notebook, he said. Near the end, after she knew she was sick. She wrote, I was not a warm mother. I showed love through doing rather than saying, and my children needed both, and I only gave them one. Agnes found her way to forgive me for it. Warren hasn't had cause to try yet. I hope when he does, the shop will still be standing and the door will be open, because that's the truest thing I know how to say. He stood to go, and Agnes stood as well. And they were not people who had learned to reach for each other easily. But she put her hand briefly on his arm as he turned and he stopped and nodded again, and that would have to be enough for now, and probably was. It was enough. Spring came slowly, the way it does along the St. Lawrence. The gray flannel coat was finished by March and hanging in the window, not for sale. Agnes had put a small card on it that said simply, Ask. Paulette had understood immediately. Donut's daughter, home from nursing school for the weekend, had tried it on and cried a little, and said it fit perfectly, and Agnes had told her it was hers, and wouldn't hear otherwise. The appointment book was full 2 weeks out. Word had spread the way word spreads in small places, slowly and completely, that Irene Thibodeau's daughter had come home and reopened the shop, and that the side door was still unlocked, and the jar was still on the counter. On a Tuesday morning in early April, the front bell rang while Agnes was at the pressing board, and she looked up to find a young woman in the doorway, maybe 25, with a little boy on her hip, and the wide, careful eyes of someone who has been making difficult calculations for a long time. Her coat was too light for the morning. She had the boy's mittens tucked into her pocket, and one of them had fallen on the step outside. Agnes came around the counter and picked up the mitten from the step. Come in, she said. Sit anywhere. The chairs by the window are the warmest. The young woman came in. She sat. The boy looked around at the dress forms with serious interest. I heard, the woman said, that this was a place. She stopped. Started again. Someone told me that if I needed, she stopped again. Her eyes had filled and she was fighting it, and Agnes recognized that fight precisely. You don't need to explain, Agnes said. That's not how this place works. She looked at the boy. Have you two eaten this morning? The woman shook her head. All right. Agnes went to the small kitchen through the back, the one her mother had installed 20 years ago, for no reason anyone had understood at the time, and she put the kettle on and took out the bread and the eggs and the jar of jam she'd bought at the farmer's market the week before. She made the boy toast with the jam cut in triangles, the way her mother had always cut hers when she was small enough to stand on a step stool. She made the woman tea and eggs, and she carried it all out herself and set it down without ceremony. Thank you, the woman said. Her voice was barely above speaking. I didn't know where else to come. You're in the right place, Agnes said. Take your time. The shop doesn't close early. She went back to the pressing board. The iron moved across the fabric in long, even strokes. Through the front window she could see Rue des Pins beginning to fill with the morning. Cars, a woman walking a dog, the delivery truck outside the bakery, all of it ordinary and ongoing. Late that afternoon, with the last customer gone, and Paulette locked up across the street and the boy and his mother, long departed with a small bag of items. Agnes had quietly assembled from the corner shelf. She stood alone at the work table and looked at the room her mother had kept for 50 years. The shoeboxes were on the shelf above the register now, where anyone who came back far enough into the shop could see them. The letter was framed on the wall beside the corkboard. The trust documents were filed with Archambault and Girard. The deed was registered. The jar was on the counter, refilled twice since December. Everything Irene Thibodeau had kept hidden in a locked metal box was out in the open now. Turned into a roof, a pressing board, a mason jar full of change, and a side door that was never fully latched. Agnes turned off the workroom lights and walked to the front of the shop as the day went gray outside. She looked at the appointment board, 3 names for tomorrow, and one note at the bottom in a handwriting she hadn't seen before, left by a customer who'd come in that morning for a hem. My daughter needs a prom dress altered. Can't pay much. Your mother helped us once a long time ago. Hoping. Agnes picked up a pen and wrote below it, yes, call any time. She turned the sign in the door from closed to open, the way her mother had done every morning for 50 years. Then she switched on the small lamp in the front window, the one Paulette had told her Irene kept burning on late nights when the shop ran long, so people walking Rue des Pins after dark would know someone was in there, awake, and the door would open. Agnes had left it on every night since December. She left it on now and picked up her coat from the hook by the door. The same hook where her mother's coat had hung for 50 years. And she stood for a moment looking at the window and the street beyond it, and the small, warm square of light that the lamp made against the coming dark. Her mother had spent 50 years pressing out the wrinkles in other people's lives quietly, precisely, asking nothing, and recording everything in shoeboxes. No one was meant to find until the right person came looking. And when she couldn't do it anymore, she had hidden the truth of it in a locked room and trusted that the daughter who had lost her way would find it and recognize herself in it and keep the light on after she was gone. Agnes turned the lamp up one notch brighter. There was work to do in the morning. There was always work to do in the morning, and she was not afraid of it anymore, and that, she thought, was as close to ready as a person ever gets.